Now let's talk a little bit about noise. So if you remember, noise is represented by those little squiggly lines. Notice that I have one in both the sender and the receiver, but I also have one across the message and across the encoding and the decoding. So noise can happen anywhere in the process. And our book is going to give us 4 kinds of noise. I've seen texts, by the way, that have 12 kinds of noise or 7 kinds of noise. 4 is fine. They're kind of general categories. But if you take another communication course, you might see a different list. Perfectly fine. So the first kind of noise, of course, is physical noise. That would be noise in the environment. My phone rings. Your phone rings. My dogs bark. Somebody comes to my door. My neighbor's mowing his lawn. Whatever it is. That's noise in the environment. It's not just auditory noise, though. It could be the temperature of the room. It could be the lighting. All of those things are physical noise. That means noise that's not inside of me and not inside of you, but in the environment between us. The other 3 kinds tend to be within the communicators. So for instance, the next one is physiological. Okay, physiological. That means a physical barrier in me or in you. Now it could be a temporary barrier, like we're sick, or I have a headache, or I'm super hungry, which I kind of am, or maybe I drank too much caffeine. That never happens. Or maybe it's a more permanent barrier. For instance, I need to put my glasses on in order to see better. Or I might have a hearing impediment. Or maybe I have a speech impediment or something about my speech that is inhibiting your ability to understand me. So those would be physiological barriers. Psychological barriers, on the other hand, are more like judgments, stereotypes, maybe emotional noise, things that are going to affect my mental judgment of your message. Maybe I just got in a car wreck and I'm super upset, and so I'm not really I'm not really decoding your information well. Or maybe I've just gotten a car wreck and I'm very upset, so I'm having trouble explaining what happened because I'm not encoding well. So that's a type of psychological noise. But another type of psychological noise, it wouldn't be so situational, like, oh, I'm in a car wreck, so I'm upset. It might be my prejudicial judgment of you or yours of me. Because as you can tell, I'm a middle-aged white woman, and maybe that carries some message for you where you devalue the information because of that. If I were a teenager, maybe I just looked super young, maybe that would also cause you to devalue the information. So psychological is any kind of cognitive, mental, emotional interference. And then the last type is called semantic. Language barriers. Those would be like if I use words that you don't understand, vocabulary noise, but it could also be grammar noise. For instance, if I just give my message in a disorganized way, or I use grammar that you don't understand. That can sometimes be an inhibitor when we are speaking with people for whom, like maybe we're speaking in our native language, but for them, this language is maybe a second language or a third language. Or maybe I'm trying to speak Italian, which I know a little bit of, but I tend to not know grammar really well, so my grammar might be a semantic barrier for people who are listening to me and they're native Italian speakers. So semantic language or semantic noise would be some kind of language noise. For instance, you don't know a whole lot about me, but one of the jobs that I have now, I have like 4 jobs. I'm a retired teacher, and I now work part-time doing lots of things. I think that was in my introduction. But one of the things I do is that I train K through 12 educators in techniques to make their classes more highly engaging. So even that might be a term you don't know. So I use a lot of educatories like differentiation and PBIS and depth of knowledge, and I can use these with my audience because they're going to understand it. But if I use these terms with a non-educator audience, they might not, and therefore we would have semantic noise. All right, so those are the 4 kinds of noise. We've got physical, in the environment, between you and I, somewhere out in the environment. We have physiological, that's physical noise within one of us or both. We have psychological noise, which would be mental or emotional noise in one of us, and we have semantic noise, also known as language noise, which could be my vocabulary or it could be the structure or grammar of my message. All right, Well, that kind of takes care of the model of communication and itemizes types of noise. We've got just a few more things, essentials, that I want to cover in this PowerPoint. So let's look first at the levels of communication, because I think it's just important for us to know in this course, what are we learning about when we say interpersonal communication? And if this is your first course in communication, that might sound a little mysterious to you. So I've identified on the PowerPoint 4 levels. I think the book gives us a couple of others, but these 4 are pretty foundational. The first one is mass communication, and I've drawn some beautifully detailed diagrams here, so to point out the difference. And actually, let's start with public communication. Public communication is what we would call like public speaking. You have a sender and you have a lot of receivers, and they're all in the same room together. So one sender is sending the same message to many, many different people. They're all going to receive it somewhat differently based on their own field of experience, right? They're all going to decode somewhat differently, but it's simultaneously being sent to all of these people, right? In mass communication, very similar, except that we might have what we would call a collaborative sender. So maybe there's more than one person involved in creating the message. I'm thinking of like a television show where we might have writers and producers, a team of writers. So we might have many people on this side of the equation putting together the message. And then we have a mass audience, which would be many thousands, millions, whatever, of people all receiving the message. The essential difference here, though, is that there's some kind of break. So either there's a break in time. For instance, the message was produced a few months ago and now it's aired on television tonight. Or the message was created yesterday, you typed your blog and people read it today. So this could be a break in time, but it could also be a break in space. So maybe the audience is watching the event live, but we're not in the same room together. So unlike public speaking, where the audience can see the speaker and the speaker can see the audience, there's kind of a transactional process going on here. In mass communication, there isn't. The sender and the receivers don't see each other, and that causes a break in either time or space. We're not really studying either one of those levels. There are courses here at Webster and other institutions you can take to study those levels. Highly recommend a course in public speaking at some point in your college career. So valuable. We're really focusing on these other 2 levels, small group and interpersonal. So in interpersonal communication, we have just kind of like the model we just saw, person A and person B, and that communication is going back and forth constantly. And in small group, we kind of have the same thing, just with more people. But if I can find my pen, I'll use this one. Really, I would say small group is just a whole bunch of interpersonal transactions going on at the same time. So kind of think of maybe your family dynamic, and there are different members of your family. And really, each one of these is one communication relationship and one communication dynamic that all kind of fit together. You can take a course in small group dynamics, which is pretty interesting. But for our course, we're really focusing on interpersonal communication and sort of how it impacts into small group. So we're really looking at this dynamic. I think it's one of the most important elements of communication to learn, because when I think of myself as a public speaker, really, each one of these is an interpersonal dynamic. And I want to make my audience feel as though I'm speaking to each one of them personally. So interpersonal communication has all the essential elements that I really need to be a good communicator. So I think it's important for you to understand the difference in those levels so that you know what it is we're focusing on in this course. I just have a couple more slides to look at some essential principles. All right, we're going to do a unit on verbal communication later on and a unit on nonverbal communication. I just want to make sure we understand the difference right off the bat. Verbal communication is referring to the words that we use. That's the symbolic nature of our communication. Nonverbal is everything that enhances that. That would be the tone of my voice, my eye contact, my facial expressions, my gestures, what I'm wearing, my hair color, my hairstyle, everything that shapes those words. So the words themselves are the verbal message. Everything else is nonverbal. I could give a purely nonverbal message, which means I could just communicate to you with no words like this. So I'm sure I communicated something to you, but I used no words. I think it's almost impossible, though, to have a purely verbal message. I'm thinking, what would that look like? If I typed out a sentence on a piece of paper, is that purely verbal? Well, I don't know. The fact that I typed it creates a nonverbal element, right? What if I had handwritten it? What about the font that I use? If I text you, is that now completely verbal? Well, I don't know. I think there's still a nonverbal element. We still try to add nonverbal by our little emojis and fonts and all caps and things. But even the fact that I'm texting you on my phone adds a nonverbal element. So, verbal versus nonverbal. We'll talk in more detail about those in our units, just to give you an idea that those are important concepts to keep in mind. The next principle talks about the varied forms that communication can take. So, of course, there's face-to-face and online. And the difference between synchronous and asynchronous just means, are we in real time or are we not in real time? So I was just texting my friend Amy a little while ago because she's at a clothing store, and she's texted me a picture of something and said, "Hey, Peggy, do you want me to get this for you?" We were texting back and forth, so we were kind of almost synchronous, but if I don't notice her message for quite some time and then I reply and there's time gaps, then that would be called asynchronous communication. And then the idea of choice points really means that's where our skill comes into play. So how we decide at each choice point what is going to be the best way to proceed with our communication is going to determine whether we're effective or not. Choice points just simply means I have a moment where I can choose how to reply. What should I say? Do I say anything? Because silence is also a communicator. So those are what we mean by choice points.